The world wasn't prepared for what happened that day. Cameras flashed, analysts speculated, and markets trembled, as a young African leader took the stage and said words that would echo across continents. It wasn't a declaration of war nor a diplomatic insult. It was something far more powerful, a declaration of independence, not of land, but of wealth. In that moment, the old rules began to crumble. The gold that had long flowed one way, from Africa to the West, was about to find its way home. And those who once dictated the global order realized, perhaps for the first time, that Africa was no longer playing by their script. For centuries, Africa's story has been written in gold. It is a story of beauty and brilliance and of betrayal. From the ancient mines of Nubia to the dust-filled fields of the Congo, gold has always been more than a metal here. It has been power. It financed empires, shaped trade routes, and built the wealth of nations far beyond the continent's borders. But while Africa possessed the treasure, others wrote the terms. Colonial empires extracted, corporations refined, and global markets set the prices. Africa was left with the holes in the earth, while others wore the crown. When Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso rose to power, few imagined his leadership would ignite such a global debate about the meaning of sovereignty. To many in the West, he was merely another revolutionary voice in a restless region. But to millions of Africans, he represented something far greater, a return of pride, a refusal to accept dependency, and a challenge to an economic order that had kept the continent rich in resources yet poor in reality. His message was simple but seismic. Africa must own its own gold. Burkina Faso is not a large country by global standards. It lacks the oil fields of Nigeria or the vast coastline of South Africa. But beneath its soil lies something more valuable than both, an abundance of gold that has quietly fueled foreign profit for decades. French companies, Canadian miners, and global conglomerates have extracted billions in revenue. While the people of Burkina Faso often remained in poverty, their environment scarred and their economy dependent on foreign capital. It was a familiar pattern, the same one that stretched from the diamond mines of Sierra Leone to the cobalt pits of Congo. Traore looked at this pattern and asked a question that most African leaders had long avoided. If Africa is so rich, why are Africans poor? It was a question that cut to the heart of history and to the nerves of those who benefit from the status quo. When he announced the nationalization of several gold mining operations and called for new partnerships that kept wealth within Africa, the reactions were swift. Western investors warned of economic disaster. Analysts accused him of populism. Yet across African streets and social media, the mood was electric. For the first time in years, ordinary people saw a leader daring to say what many had whispered, that true independence means economic control, not just political sovereignty. But this movement did not begin with Traoré alone. It was part of a wider awakening, a quiet revolution spreading across Africa's Sahel, where nations long treated as clients of Western powers began to redefine their alliances. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, three landlocked nations once viewed as peripheries of global politics, suddenly became the center of a new conversation about justice, resource control, and dignity. Their leaders questioned not only foreign military presence, but the entire economic system that had kept their countries tethered to external interests. The tension reached its symbolic climax when the United States proposed new gold-backed trade partnerships, a strategy meant to stabilize the dollar in a changing global market. But Africa was no longer the passive supplier. Traoré's government publicly rejected the terms, insisting that no deal would proceed without African ownership at its core. To many in Washington, it was a shocking move, a small West African nation refusing the economic script written by the world's largest power. But to Africans watching from Accra to Addis Ababa, it was a moment of vindication. Behind the headlines, however, lay a deeper story, one that stretched from the colonial era to the corridors of modern finance. The so-called Trump Gold Initiative, as commentators later dubbed it, aimed to create a network of strategic gold suppliers across Africa to support U.S. reserves and counter Chinese influence. It was not inherently malicious, but it was familiar. Like so many projects before it, it assumed Africa's role was to provide, not to profit. Traoré's refusal, therefore, was not just about one deal. It was about history itself. To understand why this moment resonated so deeply, one must return to the origins of the global gold trade. During the European colonial expansion, gold from West Africa helped fuel the rise of Western economies. British and French treasuries depended on African resources to maintain their currencies and build their empires. When colonialism officially ended, the mechanisms of extraction simply changed form. Multinational corporations replaced governors, contracts replaced conquests, and institutions like the IMF and World Bank shaped economic policy in ways that continued to favor the same flow of wealth outward. By the early 21st century, Africa supplied over 20% of the world's gold, yet accounted for less than 5% of global gold reserves held in its own banks. The contradiction was glaring. The continent that mined the treasure had almost none of it in its vaults. This imbalance became the focus of Traoré's campaign for economic decolonization. He argued that Africa must not only mine gold, but refine it, store it, and use it to back its own currency reserves. This, he said, was the only way to break free from the endless cycle of dependency. His words struck a chord far beyond Burkina Faso. Across the continent, economists, activists, and even rival leaders began to echo the sentiment. In Ghana, debates over resource contracts intensified. In South Africa, policymakers revisited the legacy of mining inequality. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where cobalt and gold coexist with immense poverty, young people began asking the same question: why should foreign firms profit more from our land than we do? This growing wave of consciousness, sometimes called the new Pan-Africanism, was not about isolationism. It was about fairness. African leaders were not rejecting global trade. They were demanding new terms. And for Western economies used to dictating the rules, this was unsettling. The confrontation between Traoré's government and international gold markets soon turned symbolic. Reports emerged of Burkina Faso exploring gold trade agreements with Russia, China, and Middle Eastern countries that offered more equitable returns. The shift sent ripples through financial institutions that had long viewed Africa as a predictable supplier. Suddenly, the continent was becoming an independent actor, capable of influencing global prices and challenging the traditional order. Meanwhile, in Western media, the narrative split into two. Some portrayed Traoré as a visionary challenging centuries of injustice. Others painted him as a reckless populist risking his nation's stability. But those who listened closely to his speeches heard neither extremism nor naivete, only conviction. He spoke of Africa's right to define its destiny, to own its resources, and to decide when and how they would be shared with the world. In one of his most quoted lines, he declared, "Africa has no reason to beg for what is already hers." The phrase became a rallying cry across the continent. University students in Dakar chanted it during rallies. Artists painted it on murals. Economists debated it in think tanks. Even leaders of neighboring nations, once cautious about defying global powers, began adopting similar rhetoric. What began as a statement about gold became a movement about dignity. But change, as history has shown, rarely comes without resistance. Western investors began to pull back from certain projects. Sanctions were discussed, aid packages reviewed. The international community expressed concern over what they termed resource nationalism. Yet behind closed doors, many admitted privately that the world was witnessing a long overdue correction. The balance of power was shifting, slowly but unmistakably. At the same time, Africa's alliances were evolving. A new generation of leaders looked eastward and inward, exploring trade and defense agreements that prioritized mutual respect over dependency. Pan-African institutions gained renewed relevance, and conversations about creating a continental gold reserve began to take shape. The idea was bold. If African nations pooled even a fraction of their gold holdings, they could establish a powerful economic shield, one that could stabilize currencies, reduce reliance on foreign reserves, and give the continent leverage in global negotiations, as Traore himself put it in a later address. Gold should not only shine in the hands of others, it must secure the hands of Africans. That idea, Africa securing its own hands, became the moral center of this new movement. But the story of Africa reclaiming its gold is not just about economics, it's about identity. For generations, African nations were told that development required guidance, that sovereignty required permission, and that progress required debt. Traore's defiance, whether one agrees with his methods or not, reopened the conversation about what independence truly means in the 21st century. It is in this context that the day Africa took back its wealth became not just a phrase, but a turning point. When news of Burkina Faso's defiant stance began to circulate across the financial centers of the world, New York, London, Paris, Geneva, the first reaction was disbelief. Analysts on television panels dismissed it as political theater. Traders whispered about temporary disruptions. But deep within the corridors of global finance, a quiet unease began to grow. It wasn't just about gold anymore. It was about precedent. If one African nation could say no, what if others followed? Over the following months, the ripples turned into waves. Mali reaffirmed its own gold sovereignty policies. Niger followed with restrictions on foreign ownership in uranium mines. Even Ghana, long praised as a stable, investor-friendly democracy, began renegotiating its mining contracts to increase state control. What had started as a single leader's vision was quickly becoming a continental reawakening. At the heart of this transformation was a philosophical shift, the realization that Africa's underdevelopment was not simply the result of mismanagement or corruption, but of a structural imbalance designed to keep it reliant on external systems. For decades, Africa's resources had propped up foreign currencies, industries, and technologies, while local economies remained fragile. The pattern was clear. Africa produced, others profited. But now, the script was changing. Traore's message resonated not only with politicians, but with Africa's youth, a generation that had grown up connected to the world, aware of its injustices and unafraid to question them. Across social media platforms, young Africans began discussing ideas once confined to academic journals: monetary independence, resource-backed currencies, and regional self-sufficiency. Hashtags like "Own Our Gold" and "Africa" for Africans trended for weeks, symbolizing not just support for a leader, but belief in a new continental identity. Meanwhile, Western policymakers faced a dilemma. On one hand, they could not afford to alienate Africa, the world's fastest-growing region, rich in the minerals essential for modern technology. On the other, the old tools of pressure, aid conditions, diplomatic isolation, media campaigns were losing their effectiveness. Africa had options now. China, Russia, India, and Middle Eastern powers were eager to offer trade on new terms, promising partnership instead of dominance. This multipolar moment gave Africa leverage it had never truly possessed before. And Ibrahim Traoré, though leading one of the world's poorest nations, found himself at the center of it. Still, the road ahead was far from smooth. The challenges were immense. By asserting economic sovereignty, Burkina Faso risked short-term instability. Foreign investment dried up, currency values wavered, and inflation began to rise. Critics inside and outside the country warned that idealism could quickly give way to hardship. Yet, for many Burkinabe citizens, the struggle felt justified. After all, temporary pain seemed a fair price for long-term dignity. In a small mining town near Yaoundé, a group of workers interviewed by local media put it simply, "For years, we dug gold that built other nations. Now we dig for our own." Their words captured a shift in consciousness that no policy paper could quantify. Meanwhile, outside Africa, the geopolitical implications grew clearer. The United States, under immense pressure to secure alternative gold sources for its strategic reserves, quietly intensified partnerships with other nations in South America and Asia. European markets faced similar uncertainty. For decades, African gold had been the invisible pillar of their financial systems, a resource they rarely discussed publicly, but relied on deeply. Now that pillar was being redrawn. Ironically, even countries that criticized Traoré's actions began reconsidering their own relationships with Africa. In think tanks and boardrooms, new strategies emerged, emphasizing fairer contracts, local refining, and shared prosperity. The message was implicit but unmistakable. The world was beginning to take Africa's demands seriously, not out of charity, but necessity. Yet, for all the geopolitical drama, Traoré's revolution was as much about psychology as economics. For centuries, Africa had been defined by others as a land of potential, of crisis, of charity, of exploitation. But now Africans were defining themselves. The power of narrative, long a Western monopoly, was returning home. In one televised address, Traoré said something that struck even his critics. "We have allowed our stories to be told by those who never lived them. But the day we tell them ourselves, the world will know Africa as it truly is, not as a victim, but as a creator." The camera lingered on his face as he spoke. And though his tone was calm, the emotion behind his words was unmistakable. For many, it wasn't merely politics, it was redemption. To understand the depth of that sentiment, one must remember what Africa's gold once symbolized. Long before colonialism, before borders and flags, gold was the lifeblood of Africa's great empires, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. It financed trade with Arabia, Europe, and Asia. It adorned kings and queens, inspired poets, and powered the world's earliest markets. In the 14th century, when Mansa Musa of Mali traveled to Mecca, his caravan's gold was so abundant that it reportedly caused inflation in Egypt for years. That wealth was not stolen, it was earned. Africa in those centuries was not poor. It was the center of the world's economy. Colonial conquest reversed that order. What was once self-sufficiency became extraction. What was once pride became dependency. And in the long shadow of that history, the modern African state was born. Politically independent, economically restrained. Traoré's rise symbolized a break in that shadow. Whether one viewed him as hero or disruptor, he had accomplished something few leaders dared. He made the world listen, but his defiance also drew enemies. International watchdogs accused his government of authoritarianism, human rights violations, and mismanagement. Western media amplified these claims. African commentators countered that they were selective, emphasizing failures while ignoring systemic reforms. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, complex, imperfect, but undeniable in its significance. Burkina Faso began building new partnerships with nations willing to invest in local refining facilities. For the first time, gold mined on its soil was being processed domestically, creating jobs and boosting confidence. Small-scale miners received support programs to transition into formalized industries. Slowly, the economy began to adapt. Fragile but resilient, across Africa, similar stories unfolded. Tanzania introduced new rules requiring a greater share of gold to be sold within its borders. Zimbabwe, despite its own economic challenges, reopened discussions on resource nationalism. And in South Africa, public debate reignited around the long-ignored issue of mining inequality. The movement was spreading, not through speeches alone, but through action. The symbolism of Africa taking back its wealth extended beyond gold. It became a metaphor for intellectual, cultural, and political sovereignty. Universities began teaching new economic models inspired by African thinkers. Filmmakers and journalists documented the growing momentum with renewed pride. Even in diaspora communities across Europe and the Americas, discussions of self-reliance and reclamation gained traction. For many, this was more than economics. It was a spiritual return, a reconnection with the dignity stolen by centuries of exploitation. Meanwhile, global reactions grew increasingly polarized. Some Western commentators argued that Traoré's economic nationalism threatened international cooperation. Others admitted, often grudgingly, that Africa's grievances were justified. A handful of forward-thinking economists began calling for a new global gold framework, one where producer nations had a direct role in setting international prices, much like oil-producing countries did with OPEC. The idea of an African gold alliance emerged from these debates, a coalition of resource-rich nations pooling their influence to negotiate collectively. Though still conceptual, the notion carried immense symbolic power. It signaled that Africa was no longer content to be a supplier of raw materials. It sought to be an architect of global value. Behind the scenes, quiet diplomacy unfolded. Middle Eastern powers, recognizing the potential of a gold-backed African bloc, offered mediation and technical support. China, already heavily invested in African infrastructure, saw strategic opportunity. Russia, too, welcomed the challenge to Western financial dominance. The result was a complex web of alliances and rivalries, all orbiting around a single, ancient element: gold. In the West, this was seen as a challenge to the U.S. dollar's supremacy. Gold had always been the silent competitor to fiat currencies, a tangible store of value immune to political manipulation. If Africa, holding a substantial portion of the world's untapped reserves, began using gold to back its own trade or currency, it could slowly undermine the dominance of the global financial system as it exists today. For Traore, however, this was not about destabilizing others. It was about stabilizing Africa. He envisioned a future where African nations could trade directly with one another using gold or gold-backed digital currencies, bypassing the dependence on Western intermediaries. The idea seemed utopian to some, but history had shown that every transformation begins as an idea. As the years passed, the results of this new direction began to show subtle but powerful signs. Local industries grew around mining regions. Infrastructure projects funded by gold revenues began to improve living standards. Education programs focused on geology, finance, and engineering aimed to ensure that the next generation of Africans would not only extract gold, but control every step of its value chain. In neighboring countries, leaders took note. In Mali and Niger, youth-driven campaigns demanded full transparency in mining contracts. In Senegal and Guinea, protests called for the same reforms Traore had implemented. What had begun as a single nation's defiance was now a continental conversation, yet it wasn't without sacrifice. Burkina Faso faced international isolation, limited access to financial markets, and domestic challenges in maintaining production. The costs were high, but in the eyes of many Africans, they were worth paying. Independence, true independence, was never meant to be easy. In time, the story of Traore and his challenge to the West became legend. Documentaries, books, and films recounted how a young captain from one of the world's poorest nations stood against centuries of economic hierarchy. Whether one admired him or criticized him, few could deny that he had shifted the world's perception of Africa's place in the global order. By the late 2020s, as the world faced mounting crises, climate change, inflation, shifting alliances, Africa's stance appeared less radical and more rational. The demand for fair trade, value addition, and ownership had become the new normal. Global corporations adjusted their practices, offering better deals and local partnerships. Even institutions like the IMF began acknowledging the legitimacy of Africa's call for reform. The transformation was slow, uneven, and incomplete. But it had begun, and perhaps the greatest victory of all was not measured in tons of gold or percentages of GDP, but in mindset. Africa, after centuries of external definition, was finally defining itself. The day Africa took back its wealth was not marked by a single event, but by a collective awakening, the realization that sovereignty without control over one's own resources is merely an illusion. In his final major address before the African Union, Traoré summarized it best: "We have inherited scars, but we also inherit strength. Our wealth has been our curse and our blessing. But today it becomes our weapon, not to conquer others, but to reclaim ourselves." The audience stood in silence, then applause. not out of political loyalty, but recognition. Recognition that something profound had changed in the heart of the continent as the camera pans across the vast golden landscape. Of the Sahel, the endless sands glowing under the African sun, a narrator's voice lingers. For centuries, they said Africa was too rich to be free. But when Africa finally took back its gold, it took back its future. And with that, the screen fades to black.